Hi, everyone. I'm so sorry I can't be there for this exciting event, but I'll do my best remotely. I'm very pleased and honored to introduce Chase Stokes giving his dissertation talk. He did finish his dissertation in December, but it's great that he'll be able to join us all for commencement in person. So Chase completed his PhD in a very swift 4.5 years, completing 9 full papers published at top venues. I'm hearing some feedback here. No? Okay. And 4 workshop papers. His dissertation, entitled Combining Text and Visuals for Effective Data Communication, makes significant strides in research at the intersection of text and visualization design. Via empirical studies, his research finds that readers prefer text-rich visualizations over minimalist designs. The text influences reader conclusions with varying effects depending on context and position, and that text influences perceptions of designer bias, but has only a small impact on predictions. His dissertation uses a consistent methodological approach grounded in experimental psychology and supported by pre-registration, systemic stimulus construction, and stepwise statistical modeling to ensure that findings are reproducible, interpretable, and appropriately powered. His work provides a foundation for understanding how text influences visualization design, interpretation, and the design process. During his time at the iSchool, Chase was a cheerful, helpful colleague to everyone, and he contributed excellent teaching, which was recognized with the UC Berkeley GSI Award. And I have to say, we all miss him very much since he moved away. And oops, I hope you can still hear me. And overall, Chase was just a delight to work with from start to finish. And we're very proud of you, Chase, and looking forward to your dissertation presentation.
Well, thank you very much for such a generous introduction. I want to thank also everyone who's here today, both in person and online. It means a great deal to me that you're taking the time to listen to this. And I hope you find it interesting and maybe learn something that is fun. Okay, so without further ado, this talk will be predominantly about visualizations. I know it says text, but we think about text as part of a visualization here. So visualizations are really powerful ways of communicating information. They catch your attention and they leverage these kind of pattern recognition skills that we've developed over thousands of years. But critically, they cannot stand alone. Text is a huge part of the visualization design, and it's consistently incorporated into it. Even if we take out features like axes or legends that you might think are kind of cheating when you think about text, the use of text in visualization is still critical for communicating insights and data context to give the full story behind the data. So these text elements can have a big impact on the information readers take away. So even a simple title change like the one you see here can shift the focus of what the visualization is, though the data remain entirely the same. So here we have one chart that's commenting on the sort of flip between the blue and the orange bars, this more democracy from autocracy since the 2000s. And this other chart is telling a different story about kind of the stabilization of these orange bars after that dip. So the storytelling behind these charts is different, and the text is a huge component of that. And in fact, when we first look at a visualization, we spend about the first 3 seconds just reading the text. That may not sound like a ton of time, but in terms of visual processing, it really is. So text is an important part of visualization design, but it actually goes beyond that as well. We can convey the same or similar information in a text paragraph as you can a chart. And for me, I love visualizations. I would always pick the chart. If you don't know that I love visualizations, you will definitely know that soon. And for other people, though, the text information is more preferable. Prior work seems to indicate there's something about text that can at times be better than a chart. And this kind of finding is really what brought me here to Berkeley to study this. So this paper at the bottom here from Marty Hurst and Melanie Torrey, would you like a chart with that? I read that paper when I was applying to graduate schools. And in that, they find that sometimes people don't want a chart. And that really captured my attention. I thought, what the heck? Who doesn't want a chart? Turns out, people. And so that is what really brought me here to study how we can combine text and visual information to help audiences understand and engage with data and information. So the heart of this dissertation addresses that question, the combination of text and viz, and provides some context and empirical guidance for combining these things. My dissertation falls under 2 sort of major sides, the first addressing the visualization reader, and the second looking at the perspective of the visualization designer or visualization designs. So first, we looked at how texts affect reader interpretations and their experiences with visualizations. So we asked what readers like to see, what would they prefer to see? This goes back to that previous example and it builds on that prior work as well. So here we asked, how many people do want that visual versus the text? We then examined how text affects reader conclusions or takeaways. So in other words, when someone looks at a chart, how much are they using the text for their take-home message, or how sticky is that text in their head? But readers don't just make conclusions. They often also do other tasks with visualization, such as predictions about future data states. And we also were curious about how text impacts more kind of qualitative understandings of the designer. How do readers think about the designer of the visualization? And with that, we then turn to the designer of the visualization to think about how the design side of this equation also works. So to start, we examine existing visualization designs and how text actually functions within those designs. What roles is text serving? How do they combine, and in what context? And then I talked with visualization designers about how text fits into their design process. What difficulties arise when you're integrating the text into your design, and how do you kind of get around some of those hurdles? And lastly, we examined what kind of role text could play in visualization design. How could we use writing, like pen and paper writing down or typing even, of ideas, phrases, and conclusions to kind of affect the process of designing visualizations? So these 6 questions comprise my dissertation. There's definitely not enough time to go through all of these. So instead, I'm going to give a high-level overview of the methods behind these, and then kind of dive deep into 3 of them to give a little more detail about those. So all of the investigations into reader understanding used basically the same approach, which is this more classical experimental psychology that Marty was talking about. I start with the research question and I operationalize different parts of it. So how are we measuring preferences? What do we mean by text? What do we mean by information displays? What is a takeaway? Things like that. And so these all took the basic form of taking a group of crowd workers and collecting their responses to some metric for some stimulus condition. And these are usually between participant designs, since it doesn't often make sense to show someone the same chart twice. They've already kind of made their opinion about it. And we were, however, though, for this last question for perceptions of bias, able to get within participants. So that was pretty fun as well. So we take these responses and we do some kind of form of model comparison. So providing the assumptions of the data are true, I'll run a series of mixed effects models and compare them to make sure that adding in these variables actually improves the predictive quality of the model. And if the data don't work, I'll do something better and smarter with the data and a more apt statistical test. So behind the scenes, as Marty mentioned, I planned all this out ahead of time. So that means I did power analyses to determine sample size. I wrote all of the analysis code before I asked a single person any question, and I pre-registered all of that on OSF. So if any reviewer or lovely audience member wants to check my work, please feel free to do so. The study of text functions was slightly different. So we did content analysis and created a function framework based on current visualization design practices. And we then use an exploratory factor analysis to examine how these different text features kind of contribute to the overall design themes that we can see. And then the last 2 studies were semi-structured interviews. This was great fun. We recruited participants primarily from the Data Visualization Society, as well as public posts on LinkedIn and Twitter. And the main requirement was they had to create visualization as part of some paid role. So we had data journalists, we had people who worked for sort of government agencies, health companies, consultants, lots of people. It was really interesting to talk with them and learn more about their kind of different contexts at work. These interviews lasted about an hour as well. So in this talk, I'll go into detail on 3 studies. First, I'll talk through reader preferences for text. This was the first study I conducted during my PhD. And to this day, I think it's one of my favorites. It really kind of goes back to why I was interested in this topic in the first place and the motivating kind of decisions behind the PhD itself. Then we'll talk about the impact of predictions and perceptions of bias. This I completed my second year. This is sort of my second big paper. And the results, half of them were null, spoiler alert. And so this was definitely the study where that surprised me the most and had the most learning and growing to do as a student in terms of framing results and understanding how to find what is interesting in finding nothing. And lastly, we'll look at this text function study, which was my last study before completing my dissertation. In fact, I was at the Viz conference in Vienna presenting this paper when I accepted the job I currently have at Morningstar as a data scientist. So this really helps us, I think, come full circle in some of this work. Before we get into that, though, I cannot knowingly just leave these questions unanswered for you. It's going to keep you up at night, or you're going to have to read a 9-page paper, and I don't want that for anyone. So they are also answered in my dissertation, which you're welcome to read as well. But off chance you have better plans this weekend, because it's sunny and we're in Berkeley, California, and it's beautiful in Chicago as well, I'll sum things up a little bit more succinctly. If you are interested, there's going to be 1 slide per, so you can take a picture of it, or you can read the paper. So for this first question about takeaways, we showed crowd workers charts like this one on the right. They had some number of annotations and a title possibly. And here we see sort of median household income over time. This was all simulated data. So we had patterns and we generated data to match those patterns. So we were looking at different data shapes, we called them. So it's not real reflections of income over time. And what we were interested here was how much the text content and position is sticky, or how much is used in a reader's takeaway as they move from the chart to their conclusion. So overall, we found that annotations are generally stickier. They show up in conclusions more than titles did. In particular, these two shown here, right? So you have one that's doing some kind of external content, this technological boom you see, and that brought in that contextual information to tell maybe why this data had changed the way it did. And then also these statistical notes like maximum, minimum, or even kind of point comparisons. So like if I said, income increased from 1990 to 2010, that kind of conclusion, like statistical comparisons, was also fairly stickier or led to conclusions more similar to those annotations. Titles were effective primarily, as shown here, when they describe more like perceptual trends, more overarching umbrella things that are happening in the data. That kind of makes sense. So here, after following in increases, you're describing multiple trends, but you're not like pulling out any specific data point. And that's more effective in the title. And effective meaning stickier. In this work, this was an interview study, we examined 6 different hurdles that come up when designers work with text. That's a lot of hurdles, so I'm only going to talk about 2. The most interesting ones to me personally are about the use of dynamic text. So this is when dashboards or charts have live data coming in from some source. And so the data itself is sort of moving forward. So like here, it would be like if we receive income data over time and this chart actually kind of moves along with the years as they go by. And it's hard to design text for that, right? Your areas that you're annotating are moving. And so you might have new things come up that you want to annotate instead, or you might not be able to move that text fluidly with the chart as the data moves. And so people tended to not put text on charts that were live updated, which is, to me, disappointing. But also makes a lot of sense given the constraints of the design tools that they were working with. Also interesting is this different presentation context. So this is a word I heard a lot in these interviews was screenshotable. So you have a chart that's on a dashboard. You have a series of charts on a dashboard typically. And that dashboard has to work as a dashboard for users and also as a slide in a slide deck and also as a static image in a report. And so for that reason, you can only do so much with each presentation context. Usually you just kind of cater to the lowest common denominator. So often this meant limiting the text that's on a chart. But they would find other ways to insert it in like interactivity in the dashboard. But this was just interesting to me that you would have one kind of visual for all those different contexts. And there's more on all of these that I'm happy to share as well. In this last study, this was 2 studies actually. Specifically, we looked at this thing that Marty and I coined called writing rudders. Essentially, that's the use of writing in the design process to kind of guide the design. So you're writing down questions, conclusions, narrative story, possible titles, things like that, before you get to the data, before you open Excel, before you open Figma, R, Python, Tableau, whatever it is, you're just kind of, it's the same basic step as you would with like sketching out a design, but you're using writing instead. And we were curious first, do people do this? And they do not. So we found that about 1/3 of designers actually think about writing as a deliberative or deliberate part of their design process. And of those, they use these 4, the key questions, possible conclusions, writing out the narrative or story that could be from the data, and possible titles. That possible titles one is actually most common with data journalists, and almost no one else does that. And then we took those examples and we had designers do a short design exercise that looked at, they were supposed to visualize a couple of years of Chicago weather data and pitch to a marketing team when we should start selling windbreakers. Spoiler alert. Always. So they tried out some of these and sort of gave us comments on how they felt they affected the design process. For the most part, what we saw were that these key questions and conclusions were informative for centering the user. So it really helped somebody think through, what is my user or my reader going to come to the chart and ask? Or what might they take away? Things like narrative or story or possible titles felt too prescriptive, right? You might not have gotten into the data yet. In fact, of this design, you hadn't. And so you don't really know yet what that story is going to tell or what title should go on this chart. So that felt like a little premature to a lot of people. But this was interesting. What we found overall here is that writing could be helpful in different ways, but it's not really afforded in many design tools, and it's not really used in a lot of processes. This was a fun sort of example of how text goes beyond just what's on the chart, and it goes actually into what creates the chart as well. So that's all you'll get on those. But again, they're much more detailed than my dissertation. And we'll go through each of these other studies in much more detail. So to start, what are reader preferences? So this work started, Marty and I wrote an opinion piece when I was driving across the country to move here. It was 2 pages, it was really quick, it was really light. And it basically said, people should be thinking about text. People should be thinking about language in the visualization research community, and they're not. And here's some ways that we could do that. NVIDIA approached us along with his team, Bridget and Arvind as well, and said, okay, so let's think about text. Let's do this. And one of the key things that came up in early conversations is this idea of a dial, where you can take some data or information and you can tune it in terms of the presentation to wherever it should go. You know, where would you put this dial is a matter of personal preference. Some people would prefer that the dial be tuned a little bit towards that text. Some people would prefer that it's more towards the visuals. Some people kind of in the middle. I tend to sit right about here. I think we can all think a little bit about where we would sit on this dial in terms of receiving data information. I tend to prefer charts over text, but I prefer my charts with a lot of text on them. So that would be around where I am. And this dial helped us think through kind of how would we make a progression moving from visual to text information, showing the same data or the same information. And so we constructed this set of variants and asked participants to rank them. We had 2 ranking sets. One sort of spans this whole dial, going from a chart had no title, which was crazy to make and see. It's really uncommon, to an all text paragraph that's telling more of this story in a narrative format. And then we had another one where we looked at these more fine-grained differences. We said, okay, if we add a single annotation to each of these, where do those kind of end up? And they looked more like this. They weren't as artistic as that. But they were these univariate line charts we looked at earlier. And what we found was these are the average rankings of each variant. And broadly, what you see is more text higher in that ranking. Specifically for this one on the more fine-grained one, as we added an annotation, the average ranking increased. So this was like, I think, a great way of showing that people do prefer text. But we were also interested in this all text buddy over here. Why did people like this? And how did the population respond as a whole, right? On average, it ranked 3rd, but somebody ranked it in all of these different positions. So how often was this happening? Well, I'll tell you, 14% of people ranked it first. 40% of people ranked it in the top 2. And so really what this was kind of surprising to us, but also really interesting. There's this sort of like baseline preference for text that is in some people, and a baseline preference for visuals that is in some other people. And what you see here is that, yes, readers prefer charts with additional text, but there's a substantial minority that would actually prefer just the text. And obviously that depends a lot on how you write the text. We were very careful, took a lot of iteration to write the text paragraph to go with this data, to make it read normally. But this is, I think, an interesting finding here, right? So technically, yes, the crown goes on this annotated chart, but also it does depend on your audience and kind of who is actually reading that information. Another thing we asked is why, so each participant viewed all of these variants individually and said their likes and dislikes about the particular mode of information presentation. And so we've got 3 themes that we'll talk through, and I'll highlight kind of those common likes and dislikes that came up. We used a thematic analysis for this. So first, readers were quick to tell us that they wanted more context provided for the data, even though it added clutter. This is something you often hear is like, oh, don't clutter up the visualization, chart junk, stuff like this. But actually what we found was that readers liked the simplicity for sure, but they really didn't like this lack of context. They had almost no information about the data, especially in comparison to these more rich visualizations. So even though they were more cluttered, these charts, remember, ended up winning. So there is this sort of trade-off, and typically readers will err towards this, this more annotated chart. Second finding mostly focuses on the differences between these chart conditions and the all text condition. So what we found here was that readers most often mentioned the story. So we really did our best to make this chart also tell a story. And it just didn't come up as often naturally for readers to comment on the fact that there was a story there. They were mostly thinking of this text element or this text passage, paragraph, about being more narrative and having an interesting tale to tell. However, it was more time consuming to read. It was a little more taxing. It's a paragraph that has numbers in it, so it's not that fun to read. So that's sort of the trade-off that you get with all text variants there. And finally, we found for these combinations of text and visual, in comparison to these more like unimodal representations on the sides, that readers were commenting on possible biases that the author or designer was putting into the chart, possible ways that that story was being swayed by whoever was making it. And so it wasn't super common. I think about 10% of people mentioned it about one variant or another. But these three receive twice as many comments as the other three. So it's sort of like this push that comes up when you add an annotation that people start thinking about, well, who added that annotation? Maybe why did they do that? So we'll take this all together. We know information can range from visual to text, but preferences for information presentation are a little more nuanced. First, and in most contrast with typical recommendations for visualization design and minimalism, people do want to see text with their charts. Unlike, I think early kind of Tufte-esque commentary was about pulling back from the visual stimuli that's on the chart. In this case, we actually found that people do like that. We also know that one of the motivating reasons for this is because text can provide that context, that external information that visuals alone probably won't convey. It can also be used to highlight key areas for readers to pay attention to. So key, points in history that you might be like, oh, I think what you see often with it actually is commenting on the COVID pandemic, right? So they're going to highlight that area because most data is anomalous in that region. And you don't want readers thinking like, oh, why is that? Maybe something was happening. Well, I think we all know what was happening, but it's good to highlight as well. Text alone can tell a story well, often weaves the narrative in that clearer way than a chart can. But it is more time consuming and difficult to read. So kind of using this when the population makes more sense, or when your user preferences are geared toward this, or when the telling of the story is what's important. And finally, we found that this text can sometimes lead to suspicion on the reader's behalf. They may worry they're being misled by the designer or not seeing the full story behind the data. So this led directly into our next research question, which we completed with the help of Cindy Sean Bearfield, who was I was her undergrad research assistant when she was in grad school. And she was the one who told me, you should look in high school. I said, okay, guess I will. So here we looked at how text elements affect reader predictions and perceptions of bias. And to study this, we designed, or rather borrowed from Cindy, ambiguous charts, which were designed to kind of result in relatively balanced interpretations. So here we have a chart that shows student government election voting results for 3 years. You might say who's going to win in year 4. The blue group has historically been winning, right? But the green group is definitely coming up on them. And so when it came to predicting who was going to win in year 4, the predictions from this previous study were mostly balanced between green and blue. Participants who noticed the predominance of blue or commented on this were more likely to predict blue to win. And participants who noticed the steady increase of green were more likely to predict green to win. And if I remember correctly, actually putting these annotations on the chart, these visual annotations, increased the perception that these outcomes would happen. So we thought, okay, well, we can also annotate these through text in some way or shape or form. So here we bring them to the forefront of reader attention by saying, these votes for blue are greater, and here, green is increasing from year to year 3, from year 1 and 2. So we also had a line chart which showed these same basic patterns. This is market share of 2 technology companies. That dotted line event day is that prediction point. Same trends going on here and same kind of split prediction piece. So we just want to look at another chart type as well. We conducted 2 studies. They had the same general methodology. The primary difference between them was the content of the text we used to highlight green versus blue. Basically, for study 2, we were interested in, for study 1, we had like a taxonomy we were using, and for study 2, we were interested in kind of like testing different amounts of bias that was in these texts. I'm not going to get into all that, but I'm happy to answer questions about it. For the purposes of the talk, you can think of them as doing the same thing, the same study. So participants viewed a single chart selected from our set of stimuli, and they predicted which of the 2 groups would win. And they also told us how likely they thought that outcome would be. And we use that measure, that scalar measure, as a proxy for confidence. How confident are they in their decision that that'll be the true result? We also asked them to rate the bias of the given chart using a set of different scales. These were modeled off of prior work in assessing media bias. And we only used a scalar measure here because in this case, we were actually really interested in this middle ground, like who thinks this is a neutral chart. That neutrality was more interesting for us to capture than for the prediction case, where we wanted that to be a forced choice. We also had a control condition later on. We used a distractor task in the middle to kind of try to get their true perception of this like bias for the control condition. This didn't have any text. It just had that neutral title and the data. And we separated, these with a distractor task. So addressing our research question requires us to think about a reader's response, not in terms of green and blue, but in the context of the text that they saw. So in this case, the chart says green market share increases steadily, and someone who predicted green would be aligned with the text. Their prediction is aligned with what the text supports. Someone who predicted blue would be unaligned. So these are the kind of terms that I'm going to use. We also use the same kind of idea for bias, but we call it matched and unmatched. That was just to differentiate in the paper. But for the purpose of this talk, you can think of those as doing the same thing, right? Do you agree that this chart is supporting green, which objectively it is, or do you agree that it's supporting blue, or you disagree rather with the chart? So we'll talk through both predictions and bias appraisal results. Start with predictions. We found inconsistent results. This is where I was saying, I was looking at this data and I was like, dang, these p-values are not where I want them to be. So we also found inconsistencies between the bars and the line charts, where we found in this case, for the binary, I think it was significant for the line charts, but not for the bar charts. And for the scalar measures, it was significant for the bar charts, not the line charts. We found one consistency here in study 2. I would really not read into that. If I were any good of a researcher, I would not be espousing that as being true, and a huge effect size. Essentially, what we see here is that it's not more likely that participants are aligned with the text in terms of their prediction, and they're not more confident in their decisions if they are aligned versus if they're unaligned. So this effect was really small and fairly inconsistent. So from this, I would take away broadly, if I'm going to paint in a broad stroke here, text does not influence the predictions about future data. This was not what we expected to see. We had found the text had influenced takeaways, so we expected to see that same influence on predictions. But when we asked readers about why they made the prediction they did, they were all commenting on these visual characteristics of the data. So they were actually looking and saying, well, the text says this, but that blue group is really winning, so I just don't buy it. And so they would make the prediction based on what they thought about the actual data itself. We'll look at bias appraisals. This was, thankfully to me, as a young PhD student, much more clear-cut. For both scalar and binary ways of assessing, for both chart types, participants were really attuned to the perspective of the visualization designer. They were saying, yes, this designer supports whatever the text supported. And they were saying, and I think that the degree of support is stronger than for people who said, no, I think that they're supporting the other side, or even that they were neutral. So from this, I would say text is not a neutral component of visualizations. It has kind of varying effects on what the reader actually does, but certainly it's kind of letting the reader see behind the scenes as to what the designer is thinking or feeling or projecting about this data. And this aligns with our previous findings in the preference study and other results from other work as well, that this is something that readers are thinking about. And this actually came up in the hurdles as well. This is something that designers are aware of is happening too. They're thinking, okay, how can I limit the bias that I'm putting into my chart as well? And that was something that was difficult when you're adding text to not have a side or not take a side. Lastly, we were curious about the intersection of these findings. So when participants' predictions were aligned or unaligned, what did that mean for how they rated the bias? And what we found was when they're aligned with the text, they do still recognize this overall leaning, but that value is much lower. It's closer to neutral. But they saw that the designer had said something, but they were like, yeah, but I think that that's going to happen. So of course they're going to say it. But when they were not aligned, when their predictions were unaligned with the text, their perceptions of bias were also higher. So they were not only noticing, okay, the designer is saying something about this future data state. I disagree with it. I think that they are biased. And so what this would look like is you have this chart supporting green. Green has risen for the past 3 years. So somebody who's aligned will say, okay, yeah, green will win, and the author is slightly biased. Someone who thinks blue will win will say the author is substantially biased. And this depends on some impact, it is impacted rather on some level of bias in the text. So in this case, this was a study 2, spoiler that I told you, but basically we tested these kind of more biased things. So green will continue to rise, exclamation point. These were written by crowd workers. And what happens here is this effect gets even bigger, right? So you see that it doesn't change for the people who are aligned. It does change for the people who are unaligned. So you get this kind of pulling away from each other as the text is stronger about its line of thinking. And that's great and all, but this is about a student government election. What if it worked? You can imagine how this kind of polarization would happen in these other contexts where there is real world data and there is a perspective from the designer and there are people who disagree with that perspective. And so you see this kind of polarization in the lab setting to this effect. I think we can extrapolate that you would see it to a great extent in the real world as well. Okay, great. Finally, we're going to cover the functions text serves in visualization design. So in the 2 previous studies, we looked at what it means for the readers and their interpretations of the data, but I haven't spent a lot of time talking to you about what the text actually does as part of the chart. And this was a really fun, it was a tricky study for me because I am used to these okay, get a set of crowd workers, have them take a survey, analyze the survey, visualize the results, write the paper. This was not as straightforward. We went through a lot of iteration when developing this taxonomy. It was a really fun process. This was with the work, help of people from Northeastern, Anjanara Kumar and Gilles Padilla. And they helped a great deal kind of think about this as more of a cognitive framework for how text is working. So we'll talk through an example from the Wall Street Journal. If you look at this is a subtitle. It reads, Spain is struggling to narrow its budget deficit amid a deep economic contraction. So it's doing a lot of work here. First, it gives us, the readers, a general summary of what's going on, what can we expect to see in this chart, what kind of information could we extract from it. It also highlights some specific data comparison. So budget deficit here is just looking at this part of the chart, this lower part, and not as much this kind of top part, which would be surplus. And so adding that isolates that focus to just those bars that are below the x-axis. We also see an added focus on Spain. So we've got another sort of data set here in the Eurozone average, but really we're focusing on Spain here, so just those red bars rather than the orange. And narrowing the deficit means we're looking specifically at this visual feature right here where the data gets narrower, visual narrowing of the space, where it gets kind of closer to the x-axis. We also get struggling, which adds sort of valence here. What is Spain feeling about narrowing its budget deficit? It's not feeling good, I'll tell you that. And so it brings forward that difficulty that Spain is having. We also have this deep economic contraction. So this is bringing in some external context for the difficulty Spain is facing. You'll notice this is right around 2008, 2009. You can imagine why there might be this deep economic contraction and why Spain might be struggling to narrow this deficit. It also, again, highlights this deep piece is highlighting that length of the red bars. Those are deep red bars. So this is just one text element on one chart doing all this multifaceted work. And my co-authors and I were noticing this complex functionality showing up again and again in different ways. And so we sought to answer this kind of core research question about how does text function and how do these functions combine? So we came up through a review of prior work in the area, as well as a series of open coding exercises. We constructed this set of 10 text functions, which we then applied to a corpus of about 120 visualization designs from prior work. And I'm not going to have time to go through each function, although I do have slides on them, so if people have specific questions, I'm ready. But all the function definitions and examples are in the dissertation and the accompanying paper. We'll start with, we'll talk through some interesting ones though. I want to highlight this. This was a really interesting, it's called replace mappings. Essentially, we found it during the open coding stage. It's not something that had shown up in kind of previous taxonomies. And it emphasizes the intersection between text elements and at times how they work with the visual elements in the chart. So on paper, we say this provides an unconventional representation for omitted but conventionally present element, which means if you take a chart like this, you have data labels here that are showing you the exact value of each of these points. Because all these points are labeled, the designer omitted an element that we might usually expect to see. Y-axis. That's very typical for a chart. This chart does not have one because you don't need it. The data is all there. You know exactly what the values are. You don't need to guess them from the y-axis. So there's no reason to take up space in the design for this. And in fact, this particular chart was a small multiple, which meant that there's like multiple of these for different countries. And so saving space in the design was probably a key part of how this designer was focusing on making it. So excluding the y-axis allowed them to make it skinnier without adding too many additional text elements. We also saw this show up in the use of text color rather than content. So this is more of a visual design choice, but it also affects the text that's present in the chart. So here, these Democrat and Republican labels are colored according to the data they are aligned with, but you don't have to do that. This is called dual encoding. You could just have a legend like anyone else would, and then you don't need those labels at all, actually. Or you could keep them, but you could make them black, or you could do whatever you want with them. But the design of the chart changes, and it gets a little bit bigger as well. So overall, this function reveals some of the intricate ways that text elements interact with each other or adopt kind of different roles in a chart, depending on the design choices that a designer would make when creating a chart and when working with the different limitations that they might be working with. So this is also from the Wall Street Journal. The summarized concepts function was born from some in-depth analyses of titles and their unique contributions to a visualization. I want to emphasize this is not a function that is unique to titles. There's a lot of work on titles in the visualization literature because they're interesting. They do a lot of level setting work. That's what this function is doing. And they have a lot of impact on how people interpret visualizations. But this function can be served by, and it was in some cases, by annotations. Often it is served by titles. So essentially this is some high level summary, level setting, or gist communication that the text is doing, often in combination with some other function, but not always. There were two ways we were able to categorize or group this function. First, the title or this, sorry, not title, the text could summarize concepts through just stating the variables. So for example, here, it just tells you what the chart is showing. What is that data value? And eagle-eyed audience members will notice there's also no y-axis here because you're telling me what the variable is and you're pointing out the important values. You just don't need one. So this is also doing replace mappings. So you could just tell me what the variable is. On the other hand, you could also synthesize the data shown. So this title is essentially saying there's more blue than red on this chart. And so you're giving me some insight into what the data is showing, what I might take away, and some additional kind of data analysis work is being done here. Sometimes when designers are being funny, it would do both. So this is a chart showing rainfall and it's decreasing. And so the title is falling rains. So this is both saying, so it's kind of a pun, falling rains typically means a lot of rain, like the rainfall is happening, but this is showing a decrease in rainfall. So you have a little wordplay going on there. And then at the same time, it's not only telling you what the variable is that's shown, but it's also telling you what the trend in the data is. This is something that showed up actually fairly frequently in Wall Street Journal charts where they do these like little 2 or 3 word quips at the start of the chart, which is very, very fun if you ask me. But this is kind of unique, so this is doing both variable communication and trend communication, and it's really short too. So it's a lot of information packed into one text element. And lastly, we'll talk about how text can highlight valence or emotions. This is a chart showing some COVID-19 case data. And there's an annotation here that says, should we worry? And it's specifically looking at this like kind of peak here. And this is one of our clearest examples of this function. We lacked direct input from designers. We couldn't talk to the designer who made this. We didn't show it to anybody. So it was sort of on us to figure out, is this text doing some valence work? Is it doing some kind of emotional response appeal? And so to assess this, we thought about whether a phrase could be rewritten more neutrally to remove the possible valence. In this case, you could just say increase. You could say spike. But instead, this should we worry is actually calling out that emotion that you might be feeling or the reader might be feeling. And it ties into the content of the chart. But critically, the chart didn't have to be about something concerning for valence to happen. And there's also, we were clear to distinguish that just because text is on a chart where something concerning is happening does not mean it's doing necessarily this work. So if it had just said, large spike, even that wouldn't be doing this kind of like valence subtext work, even though it's about COVID, and so a large spike is concerning. So these 10 text functions encompass a wide range of text. We looked at axes, legends, titles, captions, annotations, accompanying paragraphs, which we called like descriptions, any text that was on a chart we were looking at. And so this set of functions captures a great deal of important nuance as we think about how text communicates or supports key information for data visualization. And so after we came up with this, we coded the designs and found how often these functions show up, and we looked at how they combine. So to do this, we conducted a factor analysis on the level of the image itself using a set of variables, the text functions, obviously. We also looked at the type of text that what types of text the image had, what visual elements were associated with the text. So if we go back really briefly, this arrow, that's interesting. That's part of the text element is what we coded it as. So we looked at those visual elements. We also looked at where the chart came from. We looked at whether the text had any color, what the purpose of that color was for highlighting, for style, for encoding. And we also looked at the word count of the chart. So the total word count, as well as how long the title, subtitle, and annotations were relative to that total word count. These all went in as zeros and ones into a factor analysis, which is heavily detailed in my dissertation. And the best fitting model contained 4 factors, example of which can also be found in the dissertation, but I will show them as well. First factor captured charts that were fairly neutral in their text use. So these were charts that had titles that described the variables shown, particularly long subtitles typically as well. These were often doing some kind of additional like data work or descriptions of the chart. And they often contained captions that had metadata. And they tended to be from news sources, which really fits in with that need to attribute your source. You have metadata often in the caption, you have short neutral titles. This chart is an example, it's from The Economist, and this mobile phone market is really simple. You have like this subtitle or this caption, that's doing some source attribution, but otherwise the text is like very neutral in this chart. The second factor captured designs that relied heavily on annotations. So these tended to have shorter titles actually, and more annotations. And these annotations tended to explain how to read the chart. So sometimes they would replace chart elements like we talked about earlier. Also compare mappings is something that came up. That's essentially when like, well, I'll show you an example, but essentially like, instead of saying what the mapping is, you say this direction is more this direction is less this. So you're kind of interpreting what somebody might read that axis to be. These designs were also less likely to be part of a government report. These are like more ad hoc designy designs is kind of how I would call them. So for example, this chart is doing annotations to a lot of heavy lifting, actually has no title, which is really rare. And these annotations, these long kind of paragraph ones, are telling you what that shading means. They're kind of interpreting that for you. These arrows are telling you, how can you interpret this axis being what like prior to this point or projected growth. So telling you a little bit about what how to interpret that, helping you scaffolding that understanding. And so this fell into this annotation-centric design factor. The third factor was particularly interesting. All text functions were relatively common for these charts. The focus instead is on the visual presentation of the text. So I want to emphasize too that this color use or the visual elements, that didn't mean that they were on the chart in general, but meant specifically they were attached to a text element, indicating that it was part of this data point or that it was tied to this other area. These designs also use logos, and they tended to have a lot of words, which was interesting because the factor is mostly about visuals, but because they were visuals, there were text associated, so the gradient tended to be higher. This example uses lines, logos, these kind of circle points. It's a very visually interesting chart, and that's what the text is doing as well. So you have all of these kind of describing, this is a legend kind of functionality here. You have different annotations with these arrows. Again, here you've got a logo here. This is a logo as well in the caption. And so it's the visuals are there to augment the chart's text and kind of tie them together. And the final factor centered primarily on these interpretive functions that provide some synthesis of the data, possibly some additional context, this emotional charge. They tended to look more typical, so they have axes, basically is what that means. And they were less likely to come from social media. So this is an example, Wall Street Journal. Debt struggle, doing some emotional valence. This is describing the trends. You have a point call out at that last annotation. And so this is really a narrative forward chart. It's doing narrative framing of the data with the text. That's the same as what we looked at earlier. This other Wall Street Journal, also doing narrative framing, it has all of these key components of factor 4. But what was interesting is we have these kind of design, you could call them templates or themes or groupings. And so it offers an opportunity for informed redesign as well. So say I have this chart, but I don't really want it to be so narrative. I want it to be more annotation centric. I want it to be kind of doing more of this interesting work conveying the mappings of the chart. Well, I can remake it. I can take the exact same data and change the framing of the data. I can change how the chart feels. Here we have annotations that compare mappings. That's those arrows. We have identify values going on with the exact value points. We have a relatively short title. We added some stuff to the other annotations, right? So we've got the legend is now annotations. And the chart, the data is the same, but the feel of the text, or the feel of the chart rather, is different. It is sort of a different chart. And that is the impact of text design, right? This is not very minimal visual changes happening here. This is text. This is all the work the text is doing in a chart. Okay, so I appreciate all your time and attention. Why do you care about this at all? I care about it a lot because this is what I spent 4.5 years doing and had great fun with it. But why does it matter for you? Why should you care about text and vids? This is a question that my parents ask a lot. Hi, Mom and Dad. So I'm here to tell you, we're gonna get a little flow chart going. First, are you a viz researcher, Jasmine? If so, yes, you should care. Text is a critical part of your stimuli design. You should treat it as such. You should examine it in your own research, or at least consider it. When you're making stimuli, text is not just, just put a title on that chart and send it. You need to think about what that text is doing and possibly examine it itself on its own. Also, if you're designing systems, design systems that think about text as well, that use text in an intelligent way, or that allow for better text creation and editing if you're making a system that can create a visualization. So viz researchers, those are my primary audience people. This is important for you. Maybe you're not though. It's pretty rare. So don't worry. Maybe you're a viz designer. Maybe you make charts. Maybe you make them as part of your job, or maybe you make them for fun. Regardless, you should be thinking about text as well. You should think about who your users are, right? What they might want in terms of the text information and how much of it. You should be treating text as that core design element that it is. It's doing so much work for your charts. And you should also think about intelligently or critically placing your text strategically so that it's doing the work that you want it to do. Maybe you're not any of those. Maybe you, like many of you on the call, many of you in the room, are simply someone who reads visualizations. Maybe you see a chart in a news article on Instagram, maybe in a conference for your field. Maybe you see when you're watching sports. I like baseball. There's so many charts in baseball. One of the reasons I like it. Maybe it's in a book you're reading that's happened to me before. Maybe you see them once a year. Maybe you see them every day. Regardless, you're somebody who reads a visualization. This is important for you too. You are now someone who can be a critical and conscientious data consumer. You can notice both what is said in the text and what is not said in the text. You can think about how those visual trends compare to the information in the text. You can be aware of how you like to consume information, so you can seek that out. Maybe you're somebody who likes a chart. Maybe you found this out about yourself today. Welcome. But overall, understanding text as a meaningful part of visualization can support clearer and more confident understandings of data in everyday contexts. Maybe you are none of these things, in which case it is always good to learn about and maybe this will be useful later in life. And I'd like to thank these people specifically for listening to the past hour we talked. So these are the areas that we covered today, some in detail and some not. I'm happy to discuss them all in more detail. But what I would say is if you're going to take one thing away from this talk, text matters in visualizations. It also matters to visualizations. It matters to your reader. It matters to the designers. It matters to you in different ways, in varying degrees, but it does matter. And I really look forward to seeing the visualization community continue to move forward and engage further with this area. I look forward to seeing it help people make better charts that communicate data better. I look forward to having it make me enjoy reading charts more. So don't forget. Before we wrap up, I have a lot of people to thank for getting me to this point. First and always, my incredible bride to be. Thank you. Ooh. Sheesh, good luck at our wedding. Also, to my family, that means both old Stokes and new UCC Lawshooks. My absolutely favorite niece as well, shout out. She's gonna love charts. We're working on that right now. Everyone who has helped me get to this point, whether through pretending like you care at Thanksgiving or actually reading papers and then telling me these are really complicated. Thank you. Also to all of my friends from Northwestern, Berkeley, and beyond, to my whole cohort, Lawrence, Atej, Nikita, Janaya, Yang, and Ando. If I'm missing anyone from this, it will keep me up at night. So do not tell me. If you are on here and you hate your picture, change your Slack picture. But I do sincerely want to thank all of you for making our time in Berkeley so wonderful, our time in Chicago so wonderful. And I appreciate all the time that I've been able to spend with it. I would be very remiss to all of my colleagues and collaborators who not only contributed to my work, but also my personal and professional development. Thanks to funders, NSF, Epic Lab, iSchool, thank you very much. In particular, thank you, Marty, for all of the work that you have helped me do over these last years. I am so incredibly proud of the work we've accomplished. I look forward to seeing all that you all get up to at Berkeley, and I look forward to staying in touch in the years to come. I'm hoping I got everyone. Also, shout out, thank you, my dissertation committee. Whew, that was close. My dissertation committee for reading the dissertation and providing such feedback on a pretty tight timeline because of the turnaround for the job market. So that was great. Oh, also, I can't forget to thank Stephen Fancaneri and Cindy Bearfield for making me a visualization researcher. I was a sophomore in college. No, I was a freshman in college, and it was winter quarter, and I ran into Cindy in the basement of a lab, and she said, "Do you want to be a research assistant?" And I said, "Yeah, okay." She works in visualizations. I said, "That's pretty cool. I work in visualizations." It was great. It changed my life fundamentally for the better. So thank you. In case I've missed anyone, a blanket thank you. You can fill in the blank here. You've all helped me be here today if you're online as well. So thank you very much.